You want to talk about nihilistic Buddhist death cults? Well, okay, welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I have another review for you. This is a review of Nicholas Pullen's The Black Hunger, which is being released in early October 2024, and I received a complimentary advanced reader's copy in exchange for an honest review. This story is billed as a queer gothic horror story, which it is. It also has some interesting fantasy elements mixed in, and so you think it would be right up my alley. And at the same time, it is dealing with ideas based in Buddhist spiritual belief and Tibetan Buddhist spiritual belief explicitly. And I have all sorts of feelings about it. To be honest, right from the beginning of the story, it just felt like cultural insensitivity at best and maybe exotification or cultural appropriation at worst. And it left a really bad taste in my mouth, and it was hard to get over for me. That may be uncommon to me as a reader, due to my experience and my knowledge of the things the author is talking about. So I did my best to kind of put that to the side to appreciate the story for what it is. And I think I did a decent enough job of that. And so what I'm going to do is go through my review just on the story itself. And then at the end, I'll just mention, I'll try to be brief, about my own kind of consternation with the approach the author took and why it bothered me the way it did. And so then I'll leave it up to you to decide where to go with that. So the story itself is really well written, and it has an interesting narrative structure. It is a nested narrative story, which I tend to like when they're done well. And so this one, you have A story and then a B story and then a C story, and then it goes back to the B and then back to the A. And the A story is our main character, and that's about half of the book in terms of page length. And the B and the C stories, sometimes when you have this kind of structure, especially in sci-fi or speculative fiction, they're creating parallel stories with totally different characters that are showing parallels between the characters and the actions and the kind of narrative exploration that's happening, whatever theme is being explored. That's not the case here. Here, those two secondary stories are means of deepening the world building and creating context for us to understand the A story. Well, the B story is giving context to understand the A story, and then the C story is giving context to understand the B story, if that makes sense, the way they're nested. I thought it was effective. Now, I will say the whole novel is written as a series of epistolary sections. So the A story, at the beginning of the story, our main character is in some sort of detention or confinement. We don't know what, and this whole thing is written as his his last testament or his accounting of events. And then the B story is a number of mostly journal entries. And then the C story is one long letter. And you see some characters come back and forth between all three stories, but not many. The B story takes place about 40 years before our main story. Our main story takes place right at the turn of the 20th century. The B story takes place in like the 1860s or 70s or so. And then the C story is a little bit before that. I thought the epistolary nature of the B and the C stories was really, really useful and great. And it made sense in the larger world and story being told, because our main character has to go on a mission, basically, and he receives a dossier of information. And so this is almost presented as the dossier he received. And that way, I think it's really useful and compelling. I did not like the epistolary nature of the A story, of our main story. It did give us a first-person narration, which I appreciated. I thought it gave an intimate relationship to the main character that I really, really liked. But I thought it didn't need this whole epistolary nature. It could have just been written the way it was. It felt forced, it felt contrived, and it didn't feel like it added anything to the story. And in fact, I feel like it took away from the story. I feel like we're given a spoiler, basically, for what happens in the very, very last pages of the book, right in the beginning of the book, which kind of neuters the emotional impact of that event when it happens later. And it's explicit. It's not like an assumed thing. It's very explicitly, something is explicitly stated in the beginning. And then when you see it happen, you say, well, of course, this is going to happen. And so you lose the emotional impact of it. And in addition, the story dragged, especially the A story and the whole first section, which was the longest section. It just felt really slow moving, and things happened, but they just felt like they were bleeding into one another. There wasn't a lot of forward momentum. And I think part of that is because there weren't chapter breaks. There weren't any natural breaks in the story. The B section overcame this by having a number of discrete journal entries. So by having these journal entries, you have a constant ebb and flow of action, right? A natural point for cliffhangers, for pauses, for breaths, a way to like infuse some energy into the narration. But you don't have that in the A story. So it just kind of drags on, on. And even though he goes on this like journey and things happen, he starts in one place, he ends up someplace else. It just doesn't feel like it doesn't pull you along the way you'd want it to, even though there's interesting and exciting things happening in terms of our character development and what's happening in the world. The main plot of the story is simple. Our main character is a young lord of a not too important family who ends up going to Oxford, studying Orientalist studies, studying Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Sanskrit, and he comes across a passage that clues him into this potential heretical Buddhist cult that seems to be like a nihilistic cult. And he is intrigued by it, and he tries to search for it more and research it further, but he keeps hitting brick walls because he can't find any other references to it. And his advisors and so forth tell him, no, there's nothing here. It's all superstition. And then due to a series of events, he becomes conscripted, essentially, without his desire, to eventually go on this quest, because you find out this cult is real, and they are trying to destroy all life as they know it, because they believe the only way to be really free from suffering is to end all life, to end all existence. And he is on this quest to stop them, basically. And that quest, it takes him to northern India, to the Himalayas, to Tibet, to Mongolia. And that quest is, the second part of the story, essentially, the second A story. And so that's a fine, a kind of mixing of this Gothic atmosphere with a fantasy quest story, which I appreciated. I thought they blended really well. I thought the writing in general was strong. Being in first person, it was really intimate, so you got to know our characters really well. And it's important to say that at the heart of this whole story is this queer love story. The story itself doesn't center on this queer love story, but that is definitely the defining characteristic of our main character. Him and his partner that he meets as a teenager, or he falls in love with as a teenager, who stays with him throughout most of his life and throughout most of the story. And there are events that happen throughout the story that are directly related to him being a queer person in the early 20th century when it was illegal and frowned upon. But even more than it being important to the plot, it's fundamentally important to who he is as a person. And it is kind of the guiding light that his character revolves around, which I thought was really wonderfully done. I thought the love story was intimate, it was tender. I really appreciated it. I appreciated the depiction of his partner, and I really just loved that being the heart of this Gothic fantasy horror story was this queer love story. And again, the story doesn't revolve around it as much as our main character does, but our main character is the driving force of this whole story. So in that way, without this queer love story, the overall narrative wouldn't have happened the way we experience it. And so I think that's handled really well. And our main character, I think, is really interesting. I think he does a great job of making our main character and some of these secondary characters to feel lived in. They feel genuine. They have very complicated lives and emotions. They don't feel like cardboard cutouts. Our antagonist, or antagonists, I should say, do feel a little stereotypical. They feel very mustache twirly, and their overall aim is simply to destroy all life, and they feel like they want to watch the world burn down, and they want to be the ones that light the match, basically. So they find this, black magical power in this nihilistic death cult that is like a heretical Buddhist ideology, supposedly, and they exploit that to gain power for themselves, to try to end all life as we know it. That's their only goal. So they're very, capital E evil, and not particularly interesting. I mean, we get some backstory on them, but they don't feel well-rounded. But that's okay, because their protagonists, I think, and some of the secondary characters that are in the orbit of our protagonist are interesting enough that they carry the story. And our antagonists serve as a foil for our reluctant hero, which is, I guess, their real goal, or their role, rather, in this story. So while I didn't think the antagonists or their really rationale or reasoning was particularly well developed, I thought the protagonists were really well developed and were engaging, interesting characters that you want to spend more time with. I was invested in both his emotional journey and his love story, and also how he was existing in the world, how he was either succeeding or failing, or going about whatever it was he was trying to do in his studies, or his later working for the British government, or then going on this quest to save all of existence, essentially. So I thought the writing was strong. Sometimes it was a little bit poetic or lyrical, not much, but a little, but you could get away with it because it was written in the first person and from this epistolary point of view. So it made sense in that way. But most of the writing was just pretty straightforward, and I appreciated it. I thought it did exactly what the story needed to do. Again, I think it dragged on that first section, not because the writing wasn't strong, and not even because the narrative structure wasn't strong, but simply because it needed to have more breaks. It needed to have some more compelling way to push the reader from one event to the next. Whereas that whole first section, which is the longest of the sections, just felt like it was bleeding from one event to another without real delineation. So the stakes were hard to experience in that whole first section. So that could have been improved, but overall the writing was strong. The dialogue felt genuine. I mean, I don't know much about early 20th century British dialogue, and they definitely, the way our Tibetan and other Himalayan and Mongolian characters spoke was wildly inaccurate. Sometimes they were speaking in English, sometimes they were speaking in Tibetan or Mongolian or another language, and it was being translated by another character, and it was laughable. And very much it was a Western idea of what they would sound like most of the time, not all the time, but it was fine. It didn't feel contrived, and it only felt that way because I know these texts and these people and this culture. Overall, it was fine. The dialogue felt natural enough, at least for the world that was being built here. This crazy sect, this heretical sect, was reinterpreting the mythos or the legend of the historical Buddha, the way the story of the historical Buddha is taught in the historical Hinayana schools, is that he was born as a human being, he was a prince, he experienced suffering by different ways, and then he gave up his princely life and committed himself to finding how to be free from suffering. And he went through all these different ascetic practices and meditative practices and finally realized that that extreme path wasn't working. And so he contemplated the nature of reality, had great insight, and was able to discover what it means to be free from suffering in the world. And that's how he became a Buddha. So this heretical cult doesn't believe that story happened that way. They believe that after realizing that there's suffering in the world, the historical Buddha instead decided the only way to be free from suffering was to destroy all life. And anyone, especially Tibetan Buddhists, but any Buddhist will right away say that is a total misunderstanding. When you destroy life, you don't get free from samsara. You just continue in samsara over and over again. There's no way to destroy any individual life and have it be permanently destroyed. So it's like a really totally discordant with anything any Buddhist would teach. And that's fine to have this crazy heretical cult believe this. I think that the Buddhists' response to that cult felt far-fetched, and they didn't feel like an appropriate response given actual Buddhist religious doctrine. But the cult itself I thought was interesting, to have a doomsday cult essentially where they are hastening doomsday but doing it for the purpose of relieving suffering. This twisted idea I thought was interesting and engaging. And while I didn't think the antagonists were particularly well-rounded, the ideology that they were espousing and then the type of magic and the play on Buddhist cosmology and trying to incorporate other religious legends and superstitions, including like Native American religious or magical beliefs and like spiritual power from other religious traditions kind of incorporated at the end. I thought that was an interesting and fun idea, even if I don't, think they're an accurate representation of reality. I thought they were a fun thing for this cult to do. So I appreciated that. It was interesting. It didn't feel like something wildly new. Doomsday cults, nihilistic ideology isn't new, but superimposing it onto an Asian and specifically Buddhist worldview was interesting. That does come up with my feelings of appropriation, though. But before I get to that, to wrap up my kind of review proper, the one last thing I'll say is what I did feel the story was missing was a strong sense of journey. And that's ironic because the whole thing is a journey. Our main character starts as a young boy, and then he goes to school, he begins studying, he discovers his cult, and then he ends up traveling the world to try to stop this cult. So there is like a physical journey, but he doesn't make choices that lead him on this journey the whole way. He's kind of thrown into it against his will. So he doesn't have a sense of purpose throughout. And the story is asking some really important questions, both of our main character, but then of you as a reader. And the main question that the author is getting at is, what is the purpose of life amidst suffering? Our main character knows suffering, granted, he is like a well-off, privileged lord who has access to education and many things others don't, yet he also recognizes the cruelty of society, and he experiences this inherent violence toward him just for who he is and loving who he loves. And so he experiences suffering in all different ways, and he has to ask, what is the point of living in the face of suffering? So when you have this nihilistic cult that say there is no point, the only way to be free from suffering is to end it all, not just for yourself, but to end it for everyone. That's the only freedom from suffering, because everything is suffering. That twisted interpretation of the Buddhist idea of suffering and to be free from suffering is really compelling for some people, right? And so it's a struggle. Like, how do you find happiness and joy when everything is going to hell? How do you find meaning when all you see is pain and misery, when others resent you or treat you poorly, don't have any respect for you, hate you for reasons that are beyond your control? You know, how do you live in that world? And how do you find the confidence to be a proud and noble-minded person to try to help others and serve others and find joy and love and compassion when you see suffering all around you, right? That is the fundamental human question that Buddhism itself tries to address. And I think it's posed to our hero in an interesting way. And having him see this nihilistic cult as the one possible avenue for his experience is compelling. But with that said, he still doesn't feel like he goes on a strong emotional journey. He feels like he already, and maybe this is partly due to the narrative structure of it being written as in this memoir style, that right from the beginning of the story, he feels like he has completed his emotional journey, right? So we don't go on a journey with him because we know where he ends up before he gets there. So I didn't feel a strong sense of journey. I liked the questions the story was asking, both of its characters and of us as readers. I thought it was being very explicit in some of the philosophical ideas it wants us to grapple with, which is wonderful. I just didn't have the sense that our main character went on that journey, not with us, at least. We didn't get to observe it in as deep or meaningful of a way as I would have liked. But I did like the story. I thought it was an interesting take on a spiritual and cultural worldview that people may not be familiar with. And it was playing on similar nihilistic tropes that we see in other horror fiction. I thought the ambiance was really wonderful. The gothic atmosphere and feeling was very appropriate. There were some horrific elements. There were some scenes that were like really disturbing, really violent, really bloody, kind of gut churning in a few places. There were some scenes that were quite emotionally devastating. So there was this horrific element. And I thought the blend of gothic atmosphere, horror, and fantasy was really well done. I liked the nested narrative structure. I didn't love all of the epistolary narrative device, and I do feel like continuing it through all three parts did cause the first part to drag a little bit, and it kind of neutered the ability for emotional catharsis at the end because we knew what was going to happen at the beginning. But it didn't ruin the story for me, and I thought it was well done. The writing itself was strong and compelling, even if it was a little bit slow at times. So overall, I enjoyed the story. I think there's a lot to get out of it. It does give us something to think about, even though it's very heavy-handed in its philosophical ideas that it wants you to explore. It doesn't, doesn't make anything subtle, especially by the end when you see the members of this cult or the people that are upholding this nihilistic viewpoint. It's just violence and hedonism. And so the story is quite heavy-handed in that way. But still, it's an interesting thing, and I appreciate having a novel like this set in the horror genre explicitly asking really important philosophical questions about the meaning of reality and how it means to exist in reality and to live with other people, and to have at the heart of our character's journey a queer love story. I think is really wonderful and profound. So there is a lot of fun to be had in this story if you're willing to have it. Okay, so my consternation with this story. Hi, everyone. So clearly, I'm recording this section over. And the truth is, when I wrote this section of my review, as well as recorded it, I wrote it over and over again. And every time it was longer than my main review. And the recording I made was almost as long as my main review after heavy editing. And the truth is, I don't need to go into that much detail. I don't need to give examples or show how much I know of Buddhism. That's not the point. So I just want to make this section kind of short and sweet. I should start by saying I don't have any knowledge about what the author does or does not know about Buddhism or Buddhist practice, what his experience is. All I know is my experience reading this book. So that is what I'm based off of. My experience, what I'm getting from the book. And also, Firstly, I know that the main character is a scholar in the turn of the 20th century. I mean, his degree is in Orientalist studies, right? So, of course, I expect anything that comes from his perspective or filtered through him as a character to be Orientalist, right? Which is to say, I expect it to be essentializing and kind of fetishizing. I expect it to have the paternalistic attitude that is part and parcel of the kind of colonizing and imperialist project. So all of that I expect from the character. Anything that is filtered through the character when he's exploring India or Tibet or Buddhism in general or Tibetan Buddhism, I expect it to be that way. And that doesn't bother me. That's part of the character's development and how the character understands the world. But there is narrative voice and authorial voice outside of that, as well as what the author says in his acknowledgement sections at the end. And that is what bothers me. And that is what leads me to feel the way I feel about this situation. So that's what I'm basing this off of. Basically, the whole time I read this text, I just had a bad taste in my mouth because it feels like the author doesn't know what he's talking about. That's my impression. And I should say he clearly has a strong historical understanding of 20th century Tibet and the geopolitics of Tibet, Mongolia, India at that time. I'm not doubting that. And he clearly has an academic understanding of Buddhism, and he has clearly also read at least some of the sutras or teachings of the Buddha that were translated into Pali. I don't think he knows nothing, but it feels like most of his exploration, especially of the Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhist culture, come from an encyclopedia of world religions. And this feeling comes from the fact that there are just numerous things that are wrong. And I'm not going to go through all of them. That's what makes this so long. But simple things like the way he discusses Tibetan and Sanskrit and Pali languages and the formation of the Pali language and the quote unquote authenticity of Pali, are just incorrect, right? They don't feel right as someone who has extensively studied those languages and participates with them every day. And other simple things like the way he discusses Buddhist philosophies and ideas, but he discusses them as they're interpreted from the practitioners of the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon is a collection of the Buddhist teachings that are codified by a certain subset of Buddhist practitioners. It's not the entire word of the Buddha, it's not everything he taught, but a certain subset of Buddhist practitioners, what we historically call the various Hinayana schools, but there's only one of them left, and that's the Theravadan. So the schools that practice in Thailand and Burma, Sri Lanka, these places, what they consider to be the main philosophy and religious ideas of the Buddha. The way they interpret many, many things, including the legend of how Shakyamuni Buddha, the prince, became a Buddha, and including even his simple teachings, like his first teaching on the Four Noble Truths, the way they understand those Four Noble Truths to exist and the meaning they make from them is different than what Tibetan Buddhists understand them to be. I don't need to go into details, but in the book, he clearly has a surface level understanding, and he's taking these Pali interpretations of Buddhist philosophy and he is conflating them with Tibetan. So he's having the Tibetans say and do things that are not concordant with Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and with the Tibetan understanding of the Dharma as taught by the Buddha, or even the history of the Dharma, or the legend of the Buddha himself becoming a Buddha. And he has literal figures, important figures in Tibetan Buddhist history, including Tsongkhapa, as well as the 13th Dalai Lama, say things and do things that are discordant with the teachings of the Buddha. So the whole idea of this nihilistic Buddhist death cult, a heretical Buddhist death cult, that's fine, right? People, throughout time and place, people have taken a religious philosophy or idea and twisted it and gone the wrong way with it. I think that's an interesting thing. What if someone took, the story of the Buddha and twisted it to this weird, unimaginable direction? That is exciting and interesting. But the way he has Tibetan Buddhists react to that, and the words he puts in their mouth of actual historical, important religious figures, is contradictory to what they understand the Dharma to mean. It's contradictory to the Tibetan interpretation of the teachings of the Buddha. And so the way these Buddhists react is not the way they would have reacted should this kind of cult existed. And there's numerous examples of things like that, where he's conflating Pali Buddhism or Theravadan Buddhism with Tibetan Buddhism. And he just seems to think that all Buddhists believe the same thing. At least that's the impression I get. And similarly, just like ideas about reincarnation and the way the Tibetans relate to and understand the Dalai Lama, and the way they relate to tulkus or the system of reincarnate lamas, the way they understand bodhisattvas versus Buddhas and the way they identify them in the world, all these things seems to be a very surface level understanding, an academic level understanding, but it's presented as if it's the actual experiential knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism. And I don't get for a moment reading this text that the author has a deep experiential knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism. And the reason that bothers me is because he is then saying things about Tibetan Buddhism that are just kind of patently wrong. It feels like exotifying or an essentializing or a fetishizing project on the part of the author, because he doesn't have, it doesn't feel like he has deep knowledge or experiential knowledge about the things he's talking about. He has an academic knowledge, an encyclopedia level knowledge, and then he is treating that as if that were the truth. Part of the reason that sits so uncomfortably in my chest and it leaves such a bad taste in my mouth is because most of his audience isn't going to know anything about Buddhism. So they're going to read this text, and there's a very good chance they may associate what he says with the actual teachings or the reactions of Tibetan Buddhists. It just makes me feel cringy all the time. Never mind that the words he puts in the mouth of Tsongkhapa and in the 13th Dalai Lama are somewhat offensive to me, just because they're so discordant with the way both of them have expressed their understanding of the teachings of the Buddha. So I'm not going to go into more detail here. I'll just say that throughout the text, there are numerous things he says and does, not as the character, but just from the narrative point of view or the authorial voice or in the author's acknowledgments, that indicate to me he doesn't have any deep experiential knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism. And therefore, when he has these Tibetan Buddhists engaging in certain behaviors or expressing certain beliefs, it doesn't feel good, right? It feels like he's playing with something that he doesn't know a lot about, but it's interesting and exciting to him. And therefore, he feels justified in manipulating it to meet the needs of his story. And if he had a deep understanding of what he was playing with, I'd feel more comfortable with him manipulating it. But nothing in the text gives me the impression that he has a deep experiential understanding. So that's why I say it feels like an Orientalist project. It feels like, the attitudes of a colonizing force when they see something exotic and fancy and shiny and decide they know what it means. That, I think, is all I have to say. And now, I don't want that to spoil the book for you. I think the book is fun. I think if you read the book and don't expect anything that it says about Tibetan Buddhism to be an accurate representation of Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhist thought or philosophy or religious outlook, and any of the historical figures especially that he mentions, especially Je Tsongkhapa and the 13th Dalai Lama, if you don't expect any of their behavior in the book to reflect anything at all like what they would do or say in real life, then great, you can have a fun time with it. None of this matters insofar as it doesn't affect his writing, it doesn't affect his narrative style, it doesn't affect the depth of character that he's created, it doesn't affect the overall tone or feeling of the story, right? And the beauty of taking this really tender queer love story and putting it at the heart of this gothic, fantastical horror story set in 20th century Tibet and the Himalayas is an exciting prospect, And I want more stories like this. I don't want this to spoil you on the story. I just don't want readers to read it and think that this comes from a deep understanding of Tibetan Buddhism. Do you know what I mean? You know what? I could be wrong. I could be overly sensitive. You don't see Tibetan Buddhist stories in Western fiction a lot, and you definitely see stories, especially religious horror, that deal with possession and demons that are taking Christian theological points of view and mixing them with pagan and neo-pagan ideas, as well as just complete fantasy and passing it off as if it was genuine Christian ideas. That happens all the time. The difference is that the cultures that art is released into are predominantly, if not hegemonically, Christian. So there is nothing to lose, right? There's nothing at stake for genuine practitioners of Christian theology when that distorted view of Christianity is released through this art. That's not necessarily the same for Tibetan Buddhist culture and Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. Because of that, maybe I'm just overly sensitive, and maybe it's a me problem, not an author problem, not a story problem. I'm definitely open to that being the case. And that's part of the reason I wanted to record this and say I feel this way, but I also recognize that it could just be me, and I don't want this to spoil the book for you and to diminish the quality of writing of the book and the story that he tells and the interesting parts of the book. I just want anyone that wants to read the book to have a big picture understanding before they go into it. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you've read this book, if you're looking forward to this book, and including what are your ideas about taking cultural identities and religious identities that are totally diverse from your own and putting them in a piece of fantastical fiction, what responsibility do artists have when they do something like that? If you have ideas about that, you want to talk about it down in the comments in a respectful way, I'm very open to that discussion. But for now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.